Okay, here we are. A doodlecast. I just made that up, but that's what it is. I have some music on. I've got some pens. I have paper. I am ready. Maybe we'll start with this other paper. I am ready, oh yeah, to do some doodling. And that's what I'm going to do. Just going to do some just free form. Whatever happens, kind of a thing. Yep. It was hot, very hot today. I did go out. I did go out earlier. And, oh, G2, hello. I did go out earlier and went down to the coffee shop and tried to do a little bit of walking before it got to be too warm. And I did. I probably did about, I'm going to say 3,000 steps. And that was fun. I enjoyed it. But I am finding it a little hard to deal with. Oh, hello, G2. I am finding it a little hard to deal with this heat. Not that I can't, I mean, there's nothing like materially going on, but it's just, well, I guess I just don't like it. That's the thing. Hello, Nil Suluan. Yep. So anyway, heat. I'm sure other people are experiencing some feelings about the heat too. I can't be the only one. Yep. Gloria, hello. Sure, go ahead. What are you making? Oh, I'm just doing kind of a free form doodle. Didn't really have anything in mind when I started it. Just kind of, I don't know. It's ASMR drawing. Your real name is Raytea. Well, hello, Raytea. I'm also having a coffee. Yeah, I decided I would change the music too. It's not a tonsil stone. That's a good name for it though. I'm not sure what this is going to be. I'm just, I don't know, just trying out some things.
Chapter 5 of The White People by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Anne Fletcher. Chapter 5. I went to tea under the big apple tree. It was very big and old and wonderful. No wonder Mr. McNairn and his mother loved it. Its great branches spread out farther than I had ever seen the branches of an apple tree spread before. They were gnarled and knotted and beautiful with age. Their shadows upon the grass were velvet, deep and soft. Such a tree could only have lived its life in such a garden. At least it seemed so to me. The high, dim-coloured walls, with their curious low corner towers, and the leafage of the wall fruits spread against their brick, enclosed it embracingly, as if they were there to take care of it and its beauty. But the tree itself seemed to have grown there in all its dignified loveliness of shadow to take care of Mrs. McNairn, who sat under it. I felt as if it loved and was proud of her. I have heard clever literary people speak of Mrs. McNairn as a survival of type. Sometimes clever people bewilder me by the terms they use, but I thought I understood what they meant in her case. She was quite unlike the modern elderly woman, and yet she was not in the least old-fashioned or démodée. She was only exquisitely distinct. When she rose from her chair under the apple tree boughs and came forward to meet me that afternoon, the first things that struck me were her height and slenderness and her light step. Then I saw that her clear profile seemed cut out of ivory, and that her head was a beautiful shape and was beautifully set. Its every turn and movement was exquisite. The mere fact that both her long ivory hands enfolded mine thrilled me. I wondered if it were possible that she could be unaware of her loveliness. Beautiful people are thrilling to me, and Mrs. McNairn has always seemed more so than anyone else. This is what her son once said of her. She is not merely beautiful, she is beauty. Beauty's very spirit moving about among us mortals. Pure beauty. She drew me to a chair under her tree, and we sat down together. I felt as if she were glad that I had come. The watching look I had seen in her son's eyes was in hers also. They watched me as we talked, and I found myself telling her about my home as I had found myself telling him. He had evidently talked to her about it himself. I'd never met anyone who thought of Muir Carry as I did, but it seemed as if they who were strangers were drawn by its wild, beautiful loneliness as I was. I was happy. In my secret heart, I began to ask myself if it could be true that they made me feel a little as if I somehow belonged to someone. I had always seemed so detached from everyone. I had not been miserable about it, and I had not complained to myself. I only accepted the detachment as part of my kind of life. Mr. McNairn came into the garden later, and several other people came in to tea. It was apparently a sort of daily custom that people who evidently are great and soft and lovely did not let me away and on a looking on as I used to among strangers. She kept me near her, and in some subtle part of all that was happening, the talk, the charm circle under the spread boughs of the apple tree, the charm of everything. She would put out her exquisite long-fingered hand and touch me very lightly, and each time she did it, I felt as if she had given me new life. There was an interesting elderly man who came among the rest of the guests. I was interested in him even before she spoke to me of him. He had a handsome aquiline face which looked very clever. His talk was brilliantly witty. When he spoke, people paused as if they could not bear to lose a phrase or even a word. But in the midst of the trills of laughter surrounding him, his eyes were unchangingly sad. His face laughed or smiled, but his eyes never. He is the greatest artist in England and the most brilliant man, Mrs. McNairn said to me quietly, but he is the saddest too. He had a lovely daughter who was killed instantly, in his presence, by a wall. They had been inseparable companions, and she was the delight of his life. That strange, fixed look has been in his eyes ever since. I know you have noticed it. We were walking about among the flower beds after tea, and Mr. McNairn was showing me a cloud of blue larkspurs in a corner, when I saw something which made me turn toward him rather quickly. "There's one," I said. "Oh, do look at her. Now you see what I mean." The girl, standing with her hand on Mr. Le Breton's arm. Mr. Le Breton was the brilliant man with the sad eyes. He was standing looking at a mass of white and purple iris at the other side of the garden. There were 2 or 3 people with him, but it seemed as if for a moment he had forgotten them, had forgotten where he was. I wondered suddenly if his daughter had been fond of irises. He was looking at them with such a tender, lost expression. The girl, who was a lovely, fair thing, was standing quite close to him with her hand on his arm, and she was smiling too. Such a smile. "Mr. Le Breton," Mr. McNair said in a rather startled tone. "The girl with her hand in his arm?" "Yes, you see how fair she is," I answered. "And she has that transparent look. Oh, it's so lovely. Don't you think so? She's one of the white people." He stood very still, looking across the flowers at the group. There was a singular interest and intensity in his expression. He watched the pair silently for a whole minute, I think. "Yes," he said slowly at last, "I do see what you mean, and it is lovely. I don't seem to know her well. She must be a new friend of my mother's. So she is one of the white people?" "She looks like a white iris herself, doesn't she?" I said. "Now you know." "Yes, now I know," he answered. I asked Mrs. McNairn later who the girl was, but she didn't seem to recognize my description of her. Mr. Le Breton had gone away by that time, and so had the girl herself. "The tall, very fair one, in the misty, pale grey dress," I said. "She was near Mr. Le Breton when he was looking at the iris bed. You were cutting some roses only a few yards away from her. That very fair girl?" Mrs. McNairn paused a moment and looked puzzled. "Mildred Keith is fair," she reflected, "but she was not there then. I don't recall seeing a girl. I was cutting some buds for Mrs. Anstruther. I am—" She paused again and turned towards her son, who was standing watching us. I saw their eyes meet in a rather arrested way. "It was not Mildred Keith," he said. "Miss Muircari is inquiring because this girl was one of those she calls the white people. She was not anyone I had seen here before." There was a second's silence before Mrs. McNairn smilingly gave me one of her light, thrilling touches on my arm. "Ah, I remember," she said. "Hector told me about the white people. He rather fancied I might be one." I am afraid I rather stared at her as I slowly shook my head. You see, she was almost one, but not quite. I was so busy with my roses that I did not notice who was standing near Mr. Le Breton, she said. "Perhaps it was Annabel Mere. She's a more transparent sort of girl than Mildred, and she's more blonde. And you don't know her, Hector. I dare say it was she." End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The White People by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Anne Fletcher. Chapter 6. I remained in London several weeks. I stayed because the McNairns were so good to me. I could not have told anyone how I loved Mrs. McNairn and how different everything seemed when I was with her. I was never shy when we were together. There seemed to be no such thing as shyness in the world. I was not shy with Mr. McNairn either. After I had sat under the big apple tree boughs in the walled garden a few times, I realized that I had begun to belong to somebody. Those two marvelous people cared for me in that way, in a way that made me feel as if I were a real girl, not merely a queer little awkward ghost in a faraway castle which nobody wanted to visit because it was so dull and desolate and far from London. They were so clever and knew all the interesting things in the world, but their cleverness and experience never bewildered or overwhelmed me. You were born a wonderful little creature, and Angus Mackay has filled your mind with strange, rich furnishings and marvellous colour and form. Mrs. McNairn actually said to me one day, when we were sitting together and she was holding my hand and softly, slowly patting it. She had a way of doing that, and she had also a way of keeping me very near her whenever she could. She said once that she liked to touch me now and then to make sure that I was quite real and would not melt away. I did not know then why she said it, but I understood afterward. Sometimes we sat under the apple tree until the long twilight deepened into shadow which closed round us, and a nightingale that lived in the garden began to sing. We all three loved the nightingale and felt as though it knew that we were listening to it. It is a wonderful thing to sit quite still, listening to a bird singing in the dark, and to dare to feel that while it sings, it knows how your soul adores it. It is like a kind of worship. We had been sitting listening for quite a long time, and the nightingale had just ceased and left the darkness an exquisite silence which fell suddenly but softly as the last note dropped, when Mrs. McNairn began to talk for the first time of what she called the fear. I don't remember just how she began, and for a few minutes I did not quite understand what she meant. But as she went on, and Mr. McNairn joined in the talk, the meaning became a clear thing to me, and I knew that they were only talking quite simply of something they had often talked of before. They were not as afraid of the fear as most people are, because they had thought of and reasoned about it so much, and always calmly and with clear and open minds. By the fear, they meant that mysterious horror most people feel at the thought of passing out of the world they know into the one they don't know at all. How quiet, how still it was inside the walls of the old garden as we three sat under the boughs and talked about it. And what sweet night scents of leaves and sleeping flowers were in every breath we drew. And how one's heart moved and lifted when the nightingale broke out again. If one had seen or heard one little thing, if one's mortal being could catch one glimpse of light in the dark, Mrs. McNairn's low voice said out of the shadow near me, the fear would be gone forever. Perhaps the whole mystery is as simple as this, said her son's voice. As simple as this, that as there are tones of music too fine to be registered by the human ear, so there may be vibrations of light not to be seen by the human eye, form and sounds just beyond earthly perception, and yet as real as ourselves, as formed as ourselves, only existing in that other dimension. One had some shadow of a proof that the mystery is only that we cannot see, that we cannot hear, though they are really quite near us, with us, the ones who seem to have gone away and whom we feel we cannot live without. If once we could be sure, there would be no fear, there would be none. Dearest, he often called her dearest, and his voice had a wonderful sound in the darkness. It was caress and strength, and seemed to speak to her of things they knew which I did not. We have vowed to each other that we will believe there is no reason for the fear. It was vowed between us. Oh, yes, yes, she cried breathlessly. Oh, but sometimes, Hector, sometimes Miss Muir does not feel it. Oh, please say Isabel, I broke in. Please do. He went on as quietly as if he had not even paused. Isabel told me the first night we met that it seemed as if she could not believe in it. It never seemed real to me at all, I said. Perhaps that's because I can never forget what Jean told me about my mother lying still upon her bed and listening to someone calling her. I had told them Jean's story a few days before. I knew it was my father. Jean knew too. How did you know? Mrs. McNair's voice was almost a whisper. I couldn't tell you that. I never asked myself how it was. But I knew. We both knew. Perhaps, I hesitated, it was because in the Highlands people often believe things like that. One hears so many stories all one's life that in the end they don't seem strange. I have always heard them. Those things, you know, about people who have the second sight, and about the seals who change themselves into men and come on shore and fall in love with girls and marry them. They say they go away now and then, and no one really knows where, but it is believed that they go back to their own people and change into seals again, because they must plunge and riot about in the sea. Sometimes they come home, but sometimes they do not. A beautiful young stranger with soft dark eyes appeared once not far from Muakari, and he married a boatman's daughter. He was very restless one night and got up and left her, and she never saw him again. But a few days later, a splendid dead seal covered with wounds was washed up near his cottage. The fishers say that his people had wanted to keep him from his landwife, and they had fought with him and killed him. His wife had a son with strange velvet eyes like his father's, and she couldn't keep him away from the water. When he was old enough to swim, he swam out one day because he thought he saw some seals and wanted to get near them. He swam out too far, perhaps. He never came back, and the fishermen said his father's people had taken him. When one has heard stories like that all one's life, nothing seems very strange. Nothing really is strange, said Hector McNairn. Again and again through all the ages, we've been told the secrets of the gods and the wonders of the law, and we have revered and echoed but never believed. When we believe and know all is simple, we shall not be afraid. You're not afraid, Isabel. Tell my mother that you're not. I turned my face toward her again in the darkness. I felt as if something was going on between them which he somehow knew I could help them in. It was as though he were calling on something in my nature which I did not myself comprehend, but which his profound mind saw and knew was stronger than I was. Suddenly I felt as if I might trust to him and to it, and that without being troubled or anxious, I would just say the first thing that came into my mind, because it would be put there for me by some power which could dictate to me. I never felt younger or less clever than I did at that moment. I was only Isabel Muakari, who knew almost nothing. But that did not seem to matter. It was such a simple, almost childish thing I told her. It was only about the dream. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The White People by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Anne Fletcher. Chapter 7. The feeling you call the fear has never come to me, I said to her. And if it had, I think it would have melted away because of a dream I once had. I don't really believe it was a dream, but I call it one. I think I really went somewhere and came back. I often wonder why I came back. It was only a short dream, so simple that there's scarcely anything to tell, and perhaps it will not convey anything to you. But it has been part of my life. That time when I was out on the hillside. That is what I call the dream to myself, out on the hillside. as if it were a kind of unearthly poem. But it wasn't. It was more real than anything I have ever felt. It was real. Real. I wish that I could tell it so that you would know how real it was. I felt almost piteous in my longing to make her know. I knew she was afraid of something, and if I could make her know how real that one brief dream had been, she would not be afraid any more. And I loved her. I loved her so much. I was asleep one night at Muircarry, I went on, and suddenly, without any preparatory dreaming, I was standing out on a hillside in moonlight softer and more exquisite than any I had ever seen or known before. Perhaps I was still in my nightgown. I don't know. My feet were bare on the grass, and I wore something light and white which did not seem to touch me. If it touched me, I did not feel it. My bare feet did not feel the grass. They only knew that it was beneath them. It was a low hill I stood on, and I was only on the side of it. And in spite of the thrilling beauty of the moon, all but the part I stood on melted into soft, beautiful shadow, all below me and above me. But I did not turn to look at or ask myself about anything. You see, the difficulty is that there are no earthly words to tell it. All my being was ecstasy, pure, light ecstasy. Oh, what poor words, but I know no others. If I said that I was happy, happy, it would be nothing. I was happiness itself. I was pure rapture. I did not look at the beauty of the night, the sky, the marvelous melting shadow. I was part of it all, one with it. Nothing held me, nothing. The beauty of the night, the light, the air were what I was, and I was only thrilling ecstasy and wonder at the rapture of it. I stopped and covered my face with my hands, and tears wet my fingers. Oh, I cannot make it real. I was only there such a short, short time. Even if you had been with me, I couldn't have found words for it even then. It was such a short time. I only stood and lifted my face and felt the joy of it, the pure marvel of joy. I only heard myself murmuring over and over again, "Oh, how beautiful, how beautiful, oh, how beautiful." And then a marvel of new joy swept through me. I said very softly and very slowly, as if my voice were trailing away into silence, "Oh, I can lie down here on the grass and sleep all through the night under this moonlight. I can sleep, sleep." I began to sink softly down with the heavenliest feeling of relaxation and repose, as if there existed only the soul of beautiful rest. I sank so softly, and just as my cheek almost touched the grass, the dream was over. "Oh," cried Mrs. McNairn, "did you awaken?" "No, I came back. In my sleep I suddenly found myself creeping into my bed again, as if I had been away somewhere. I was wondering why I was there, how I had left the hillside, and when I had left it. That part was a dream, but the other was not. I was allowed to go somewhere outside and come back." I caught at her hand in the dark. "The words are all wrong," I said. "It's because we have no words to describe that. But have I made you feel it at all? Oh, Mrs. McNairn, have I been able to make you know that it was not a dream?" She lifted my hand and pressed it passionately against her cheek, and her cheek too was wet, wet. "No, it was not a dream," she said. "You came back. Thank God you came back, just to tell us that those who do not come back stand awakened in that ecstasy, and the fear is nothing, it is only the dream. The awakening is out on the hillside, out on the hillside. Listen, she started as she said it. Listen, the nightingale is beginning again. He sent forth in the dark a fountain, a rising, aspiring fountain of golden notes which seemed to reach to heaven itself. The night was made radiant by them. He flung them upward like a shower of stars into the sky. We sat and listened, almost holding our breath. Oh, the nightingale, the nightingale. He knows, Hector MacNairn's low voice said, that it was not a dream. When there was silence again, I heard him leave his chair very quietly. Good night, he said, and went away. I felt somehow that he had left us together for a purpose, but oh, I did not even remotely dream what the purpose was. But soon she told me, almost in a whisper. We love you very much, Isabel, she said. You know that. I love you both with all my heart, I answered. Indeed, I love you. We two have been more to each other than mere mother and son. We have been sufficient for each other. But he began to love you that first day when he watched you in the railway carriage. He says it was the far look in your eyes which drew him. I began to love him too, I said, and I was not at all ashamed or shy in saying it. Oh, we three might have spent our lives together, she went on. It would have been a perfect thing. But... She stood up as if she could not remain seated. Involuntarily I stood up with her. She was trembling, and she caught and held me in her arms. He cannot stay, Isabel, she ended. I could scarcely hear my own voice when I echoed the words. He cannot stay? Oh, the time will come, she said, when people who love each other will not be separated, when on this very earth there will be no pain, no grief, no age, no death, when all the world has learned the law at last. But we have not learned it yet. And here we stand. The greatest specialists have told us there is some fatal flaw in his heart. At any moment, when he is talking to us, when he is at his work, when he is asleep, he may cease. It will just be ceasing at any moment. He cannot stay. My own heart stood still for a second. Then there rose before me, slowly but clearly, a vision. The vision which was not a dream. Out on the hillside, I murmured. Out on the hillside. I clung to her with both arms and held her tight. I understood now why they had talked about the fear. These two, who were almost one soul, were trying to believe that they were not really to be torn apart, not really. They were trying to heap up for themselves proof that they might still be near each other. And above all, his effort was to save her from the worst woe. And I understood too why something wiser and stronger than myself had led me to tell the dream, which was not a dream at all. But it was as she said, the world had not learned the secret yet, and there we stood. We did not cry or talk, but we clung to each other. We clung. That is all human creatures can do until the secret is known. And as we clung, the nightingale broke out again. Oh, nightingale, oh, nightingale, she said in her low wonder of a voice. What are you trying to tell us? End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The White People by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Anne Fletcher. Chapter 8. What I feel sure I know by this time is that all the things we think happen by chance and accident are only part of the weaving of the scheme of life. When you begin to suspect this and to watch closely, you also begin to see how trifles connect themselves with one another and seem in the end to have led to a reason and a meaning, though we may not be clever enough to see it clearly. Nothing is an accident. We make everything happen ourselves, the wrong things because we do not know or care whether we are wrong or right, the right ones because we unconsciously or consciously choose the right, even in the midst of our ignorance. I dare say it sounds audacious for an ordinary girl to say such things in an ordinary way, but perhaps I've said them in spite of myself, because it is not a bad thing that they should be said by an everyday sort of person in simple words which other everyday people can understand. I am only expressing what has gradually grown into belief in my mind through reading with Angus ancient books and modern ones. Books about faiths and religions, books about philosophies and magics, books about what the world calls marvels, but which are not marvels at all, but only workings of the law most people have not yet reasoned about or even accepted. Angus had read and studied them all his life before he began to read them with me, and we talked them over together, sitting by the fire in the library, fascinated and staring at each other, I in one high-backed chair and he in another on the opposite side of the hearth. Angus is wonderful, wonderful. He knows there's no such thing as chance. He knows that we ourselves are the working of the law, and that we ourselves could work what now are stupidly called miracles if we could only remember always what the law is. What I intended to say at first was merely that it was not by chance that I climbed to the shelf in the library that afternoon and pushed aside the books hiding the old manuscript which told the real story of Dark Malcolm of the Glen and wee brown Elspeth. It seemed like chance when it happened, but it was really the first step towards my finding out the strange, beautiful thing I knew soon afterward. From the beginning of my friendship with the McNairns, I had hoped that they would come and stay with me at Muir Carry. When they both seemed to feel such interest in all I told them of it, and not to mind its wild remoteness, I took courage and asked them if they would come to me. Most people are bored by the prospect of life in a feudal castle, however picturesquely it is set in a place where there are no neighbours to count on. Its ancient stateliness is too dull. But the McNairns were more allured by what Muir Carry offered than they were by other and more brilliant invitations. So when I went back to the castle, I was only to be alone a week before they followed me. Jean and Angus were quite happy in their quiet way when I told them who I was expecting. They knew how glad I was myself. Jean was full of silent pleasure as she arranged the rooms I had chosen for my guests, rooms which had the most sweeping view of the moor. Angus knew that Mr. McNairn would love the library, and he hovered about, consulting his catalogues and looking over his shelves, taking down volumes here and there, holding them tenderly in his long, bony old hand as he dipped into them. He made notes of the manuscripts and books he thought Mr. McNairn would feel the deepest interest in. He loved his library with all his being, and I knew he looked forward to talking to a man who would care for it in the same way. He had been going over one of the higher shelves one day, and had left his step-ladder leaning against it when he went elsewhere. It was when I mounted the steps, as I often did when he left them, that I came upon the manuscript which related the old story of Dark Malcolm and his child. It had been pushed behind some volumes, and I took it out because it looked so old and yellow, and I opened it at once at the page where the tale began. At first I stood reading, and then I sat down on the broad top of the ladder and forgot everything. It was a savage history of ferocious hate and barbarous reprisals. It had been a feud waged between two clans for 3 generations. The story of Dark Malcolm and Ian Redhand was only part of it, but it was a gruesome thing. Pages told of the bloody deeds they wrought on each other's houses. The one human passion of Dark Malcolm's life was his love for his little daughter. She had brown eyes and brown hair, and those who most loved her called her wee brown Elspeth. Ian rid away at unspeakable taunts and threats left behind by Ian and his men. With unbound wounds, broken dirks, and hacked swords, Dark Malcolm and the remnant of his troop of fighting clansmen rushed forth into the night. "Neither men nor weapons have we to win her back," screamed Dark Malcolm, raving mad, "but we may die fighting to get near enough to her to drive dirk into her little breast and save her from worse." They were a band of madmen in their black despair. How they tore through the black night, what unguarded weak spot they found in Ian's castle walls, how they fought their way through it, leaving their dead bodies in the path, none really ever knew. By what strange chance Dark Malcolm came upon wee brown Elspeth, craftily set to playing hide and seek with a child of Ian's, so that she might not cry out and betray her presence. How, already wounded to his death, he caught at and drove his dirk into her child heart, the story only offers guesses at. But kill and save her he did, falling dead with her body held against his breast, her brown hair streaming over it. Not one living man went back to the small, rude castle on the glen. Not one. I sat and read until the room grew dark. When I stopped, I found that Angus Mackay was standing in the dimness at the foot of the ladder. He looked up at me and I down at him. For a few moments we were both quite still. "Is it the tale of Ian Redhand and Dark Malcolm you are reading?" he said at last. "And wee brown Elspeth, who was fought for and killed," I added slowly. Angus nodded his head with a sad face. "It was the only way for a father," he said. "A hound of hell was Ian. Such men were savage beasts in those days, not human." I touched the manuscript with my hand questioningly. "Did this fall at the back there by accident?" I asked. "Or did you hide it?" "I did," he answered. "It was no tale for a young thing to read. I have hidden many from you. You were always poking about in corners, Isabel." Then I sat and thought over past memories for a while, and the shadows in the room deepened. "Why," I said laggingly after the silence, "why did I call the child who used to play with me wee brown Elspeth?" "It was your own fancy," was his reply. "I used to wonder myself, but I made up my mind that you had heard some of the maids talking, and the name had caught your ear. That would be a child's way." I put my forehead in my hands and thought again. So many years had passed. I had been little more than a baby. The whole thing seemed like a half-forgotten dream when